Hello, it is a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm Faustine de La Salle. I'm the co-executive director of the Mission Possible Partnership, which is an organization bringing together many partners working on how to bring heavy industry and heavy-duty transport to net zero emissions by mid-century. What I'd like to talk to you about today is how to clean up the heavy industry sectors. And in particular, focusing on four heavy industry sectors that are currently responsible for about 20% of global CO2 emissions. And that's iron and steel, cement, chemicals, and aluminium. And so within the Mission Possible Partnership, we're really trying to understand with industry players how we can bring those sectors to net zero emissions by mid-century and how much progress we can make in the 2020s, given how important it is to bring the right technologies to market before 2030. So the good news on that front is that we know it is technically possible to reach net zero emissions in those sectors. A few years back, the Energy Transitions Commission, of which I am also the director, did a full analysis informed by interviews and workshops with more than 200 industry representatives and industry experts to understand the scope of what's possible in terms of emissions reduction in those heavy industry sectors. And what we realized is that we can reach net zero emissions through a combination of three major routes. One is to reduce demand for carbon-intensive products. And the role of the circular economy in that context cannot be undermined. There is a potential to reduce emissions from heavy industry sectors by about 40% if we're more efficient in the way we use the materials we produce. For instance, if we recycle steel and plastics much better than we do today, and if we also are more efficient in how much steel, for instance, we use in a building or how much cement we use in a building. So those efficiency levers and circular economy levers are extremely important to help us reduce emissions. The second key route, which is complementary, is being just more energy efficient, using less energy to produce the same product. And the final route, which is absolutely critical, is shifting to clean energy instead of coal, oil, and gas, which are usually the inputs currently used in those industries. And there are mostly four major categories of solutions there. Either you can directly electrify the process. So, for instance, secondary steel, recycled steel, is already a process that is mostly using electricity, and then you can switch to renewable electricity pretty easily. The second key potential is to use biomass as an input, with the caution mark there that there isn't that much biomass available that is really sustainably grown globally. The third potential option is to use carbon capture on the back of existing processes or new processes to either use it sustainably or store it. And the final option is to use hydrogen. And hydrogen is actually a derivative from the others because you can produce hydrogen from electricity or you can produce hydrogen from fossil fuels plus carbon capture. So the solutions are there. The difficulty, though, is that those solutions, and they're highlighted here in red, are generally at the very early stage of their deployment curve. They are in the emergence phase. They are in labs. They are in demonstration projects. They haven't necessarily been industrialized yet, and they're not necessarily cost competitive yet either. So the key challenge is to, over the next 10 years, take all of those technologies through the S-curve you see on the screen and bring them to the point where they are becoming more and more deployed at scale across the globe. To do that, there's a key challenge to overcome, which is the cost of those technologies. Because those technologies have not yet been deployed at scale, there isn't any economies of scale that has kicked in yet. And there's still a lot we can learn on how to produce those technologies more efficiently, which means that today they're more costly than a high carbon production process. They're very costly for some of them at B2B level. But what's interesting is that when you run the cost all the way to the end consumer, it actually doesn't add much to the cost and to the price of the products that you and I purchase on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't add much more than 1% to the prices of consumer goods. So it's important to understand that if we manage to pass on the cost all the way to consumers, we will actually enable the heavy industry players to get a fair price for greener products that they will produce, and therefore they will find it easier to invest in those greener technologies. So what can we do to trigger that change, to ensure that investment in zero carbon solutions starts flowing over the next 10 years? What we've set up to do as the Mission Possible partnership is creating net zero industry platforms that bring together all of the stakeholders in the value chain that have a role to play to create a business case for investments in new technologies. Because industry players alone will not be able to take that route. A heavy industry player, be that a concrete producer or an aluminium producer, if they are moving alone, risks facing much higher cost of production and losing to competitors. So we really need to de-risk investment in those low carbon solutions by bringing in the buyers of those products and negotiating with them to understand how much extra cost they are able to absorb. We also need to work with energy suppliers to ensure that clean energy supply is as cheap as possible and in big amounts, because heavy industry is quite energy consuming and requires huge amounts of energy. We also need to bring in the finance players because they will be able to help find the financing mechanisms that are most adapted to investment in those new technologies. And finally, we need to bring in governments, because we will need public intervention to ensure a level playing field across the industry players on a national basis and on an international basis. And we will also need government support to really get through the early stages of deployment, which by nature will be riskier and costlier. So really, to create change in those heavy industry sectors, we need all of those stakeholders across the value chain to join forces. And that's really what the Mission Possible partnership is about. It's bringing together those players and figuring out with them a few things. The first thing we want to figure out with them is what our vision of the industry for the future. What do we think the industry will look like by 2050 in terms of the types of technologies that will be used, but also in terms of the new opportunities, new business models that might be created along the way. And then from there, what we do is define a strategy, what we call a sector transition strategy, that enables us to understand how to go from today's industries to the future of industry in 2050. How do we transition progressively out of high carbon processes, and how do we start deploying low carbon processes? And those sector transition strategies are really important because they will give us on a 5-year by 5-year basis, what are the critical milestones that we need to hit? Who do we need across the value chain to do what to ensure that we're on the right trajectory going forward? So that's a critical piece of work that we're currently working on with industry players and financial institutions in particular. And then that enables us and all the stakeholders in this space to define tangible commitments to action in the 2020s that will get us closer to our goal. But those tangible commitments to action really need to be anchored in the strategy to ensure that there's no greenwashing. And then finally, we'll help the industry players implement that strategy. So the Mission Possible partnership has really been in its infancy in 2021, and we are welcoming many partners across the globe to join us, because we really want to join forces and work with all industry leaders in different geographies to figure out how together we get those heavy industry sectors to where they need to be, and how over the next 10 years we make the progress that we need to see happen. Thank you.